live on YouTube, and then we will get started. Again, apologize for a little bit of a delay. And looks like we are live on YouTube. Okay. Great. All right, excellent. Okay, sorry, now I'm getting, wow, incredible amount of computer problems here. Apologize for that. Rita said she's thinking of starting it. She's tested negative for SIBO and IBS, but have inflammation. Okay, I'll address that. So do let me know. And Laura, are you saying that you've been on the diet? Okay. All right. All right. So let me share my screen. If I'm able to share my screen, given all the technical difficulties here, and remarkably, if you know that if you've been on this before, you know that normally we don't have any problems. But okay. So it looks like you should be able to see my screen, and we'll get started. Okay. All right. So 8:05. It didn't take me all that long to recover here. So tonight we're going to be talking about the FODMAP diet. Now, many of you may have heard of this diet. In fact, probably many of you do have heard of it and maybe have tried it or know people who tried it. Now, I came across the FODMAP diet probably, maybe actually, I would guess close to 10 years ago. I had some friends who had their kids on who had a sort of hyperactive child, and they read some article about FODMAP being potentially helpful. I hadn't heard of it up until that point. And then years later, came across a few articles about people who were dealing with irritable bowel syndrome. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go through things, and how effective it was. And interestingly, many of you know me because I'm the president and founder of Miracle Noodle, and we were attending a dietitian's show in Boston many years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And I had the opportunity to talk to people from Monash University, which is really the area, which is the university in Australia that has really came up with the FODMAP diet. And we'll talk about the story behind the name. We'll go through what high FODMAP foods are. We'll talk about the diseases that have been treated with the FODMAP diet, the different phases, who should completely avoid going on a FODMAP diet, and then put some things into context by talking about some other treatments that have been shown to improve things like irritable bowel syndrome. So I met them, and I didn't actually think, given the way that the Miracle Noodles are made of a fiber called glucomannan, and actually I thought potentially that they would not be FODMAP friendly, and you'll understand why I thought that in just a moment. So I spoke to them at the booth at the show, and I said, I have this traditional product. It's made of a soluble fiber. And they said, really, we would just have to test it. So given the remarkable improvement that people with irritable bowel syndrome get, I mean, we're talking like, 70, 80% of people who try it, who have irritable bowel syndrome and other problems, can really see an incredible improvement in their gut symptoms. So before we got the product tested, they knew that I was a physician, and I was able to talk to some of the senior researchers at Monash University, who is one of the universities, the main university in Australia that does the testing to see if a food is FODMAP friendly or not. And of course, they, part of this is, as a food company, you have to pay a decent amount of money to go through the process of testing your product, as well as, once it's finished, getting approval to advertise, I guess you could say, or to publicize the fact that your product has been fully tested by the people that came up with this diet, the physicians that came up with this diet. And it was from the Department of Gastroenterology at Monash University. And so they were able to actually connect me on the phone. We had a Zoom call for like an hour and a half with the head researchers of the FODMAP diet. I was really, really amazed and had an incredible conversation with them. And really, they sent me a few articles beforehand, and I was completely blown away at the results. And just, I thought it was an incredibly elegant diet for people who are specifically dealing with what we'll be talking about, and a very common sense, actually, diet. When you really understand it, which you will, and this won't take more than 25, 30 minutes to go through, you'll really get an understanding of why it actually is common sense, and then get some idea about general ideas about implementation. But ultimately, this is about understanding what the FODMAP diet is, whether it's right for you, but it's not designed to get into any kind of instructions that you should be doing on your own. And while I would recommend for certain diets, like say the keto diet, to really spend a decent amount of time reading books and talking to people who are on the keto diet and healthcare practitioners, the FODMAP diet is actually something you can learn, within an hour after even this talk. This would be a good introduction. And then if you feel like it's something that you would want to try, you could really start this tomorrow. I mean, it's very, very easy to understand with the proper lists. So let's just jump right into it. And we'll talk about sort of the story behind the name. So the doctors in Australia, they basically were making this observation that people who had trouble digesting lactose, like in milk, obviously there are other things like fructose and other types of sugars, we're getting the same kinds of symptoms. We're talking about gas, bloating. We're talking about getting water being pulled into the intestine, so loose stools. And so they noticed that there was a very similar series of symptoms that were associated with these different kinds of short chain sugars, like lactose and fructose and galactose, these sorts of things. And so they decided that they would lump all of these things together into the size of the types of sugars. So a monosaccharide would be, a single sugar, and then a disaccharide would be two sugars put together, and then oligo would be a different, and polyols, which are things that are like sorbitol that are sometimes used as an artificial sweetener. All these things were lumped together into one category called FODMAP because they all had very similar symptoms. Again, gas, loose stools, some bloating. And so they said, what would happen if we assembled a list of foods that contain lactose and fructose? And we'll get into fructose specifically as we go through this. But I can state, obviously, fructose, many of you may or may not know, but fructose is basically a fruit sugar. And what's interesting is when fructose is paired with glucose in fruit, in other words, there's a good amount of each, the body has a way of digesting and absorbing those without actually much problem. The problem is for some people where you have certain fruits that have a lot more fructose than glucose, then that can lead to a situation where there's this fermentation that's happening. So all of these sugars that they're lumping in together, again, because they have the same kinds of symptoms, are fermentable oligo-di-monosaccharides and polyols. So oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. So they put all these together. And people who have that kind of problem, and there's more fructose than there is glucose, then you have this issue where if you're sensitive, that could cause some problems. So there's certain fruits that have a higher ratio of fructose to glucose, things like apples and pears specifically, that tend to be very high in FODMAP, where there's certain other fruits where there's a nice balance between glucose and fructose. And that then for people who have that problem, then this is a situation where obviously they need to pay attention to this. So the researchers in Australia thought that, well, there could be this additive effect. Maybe people who have this sensitivity to a very low level, if they're getting this a little bit all the time, a little bit of an onion here, a little bit of an apple here, a little bit of garlic here, it could be that all of these together are coming together and you're getting this fermentation. Now, what is fermentation? We've certainly spoken about fermentation before. We spoke about it in the context of sauerkraut, where you basically have this lactobacillus bacteria that is able to basically start to break down the sugars in the cabbage. Well, in your gut, what's happening is when you have something like these sugars, those are also acted upon by bacteria that can potentially release things like gas, that's basically going to give you symptoms of gas and bloating. Polyols, like I mentioned, polyols are like mannitol or sorbitol, these sorts of things that sometimes are used as sugar replacements. And these they actually don't get digested really that well, in the sense that they actually stay in the gut and they can pull water in from the gut in like an osmotic fashion. So in other words, this is something that some people sometimes get. They call it chewing gum diarrhea, where people are getting a certain, like sorbitol as an example, and they're chewing a bunch of gum. They're getting a decent amount of this sorbitol, which is basically staying in the gut, pulling water in, creating gas, and then you can get like runny stools from that. So the people behind the FODMAP diet said, okay, well, maybe if we get rid of all of these, then we're going to have an improvement in people who have these same kinds of irritable bowel syndrome-like symptoms. And that's how they came up with the FODMAP diet. So let's go through examples of some of the different foods, and then we'll go through diseases and phases, and then you'll get a better understanding of that. So the number one ingredient that causes problems are onions, garlic, and leeks. And now the first thing you might think of when you're thinking about this is, well, all these foods are healthy, and they are healthy. It's just that they can be a problem for some people. For some people who have the issues that we're talking about, unfortunately, they have an abnormal fermentation of these products that's creating gas and such, and bloating. And therefore, of course, they are healthy. Onions, garlics, leeks have all kinds of different things in them that are great for you. But again, if you have an issue in your gut, then it's reasonable and you think it's reasonable for you to give this a go. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Sorry about that. Okay. Now my screen is missing. Apologize. We're really having problems tonight. Apologize for that. Okay, try this again. Okay. Sorry about this. Okay. Give me a moment. Again, I'm very sorry that you're having to deal with this. It's really unfortunate because I never have any issues at all with tech here. So one moment. Okay. Let's just close everything down here. And we'll give this a go again. Okay. Okay. So let me just make sure that I don't get any kind of interruptions here. Okay. All right. So again, apologize for that. So the issue is obviously these are healthy foods, but the issue is that for some people, they're not going to be, in the sense of gut symptoms. Doesn't mean that the onions aren't having beneficial effects elsewhere, but in the gut, it could cause a problem because of a type of sugar called fructans. And fructans are found in onions, garlics, and leeks. And so when it comes to starting on a FODMAP diet, the number one ingredient in terms of these sort of vegetables are going to be onions, garlics, and leeks. Next is wheat. There's actually a type of fructan in wheat as well, beans, and then, as I mentioned before, fructose predominant fruits. So remarkably, when there's, as I said, this balance between glucose and fructose, it's not an issue. But in apples, as an example, there's more fructose. And there's also a little bit of mannitol, that polyol we spoke about that sometimes is used as an artificial sweetener, rarely so, but so apples and pears. Now, I'm not going to go through a whole list of FODMAP foods because you can find a million lists online looking for high FODMAP foods and which fruits are good on the FODMAP diet, which fruits aren't good, and then you'll get a clear understanding of the situation. So that is what's going on there. Now, in terms of diseases, there's a whole bunch that have been shown to improve these sorts of things. So we'll start, obviously, with irritable bowel syndrome. Let's put that there. So obviously that's dealing with pain, bloating, mucus in the stools. Sometimes you can feel like your bowel movement is not complete, gas, very common sorts of things, unfortunately. And some of you may have one or two of these. Quite frankly, if you have pain and bloating on a regular basis, then it could be that choosing a FODMAP diet for a very short period of time is something that you can do. Now, one of the amazing things about the FODMAP diet is that when you go on it, you can often see improvement like within a couple of days, sometimes even the next day. So if you have any of these sorts of symptoms, and of course you've been evaluated and there's no other kind of issue, especially something like inflammatory bowel disease, the difference between irritable bowel syndrome and inflammatory bowel disease is that this is essentially an autoimmune disease like Crohn's disease, like ulcerative colitis. These are very different types of conditions. So you shouldn't necessarily assume you have irritable bowel syndrome. If you're having chronic abdominal pain, as well as bloating and other sorts of things, you should see your doctor and maybe see a gastroenterologist. Gastroenterologists created this diet, and they might consider putting you on that if a diagnosis of irritable bowel syndrome is made, which is sometimes sort of a diagnosis of exclusion almost. SIBO, which is called small intestinal bowel overgrowth, is where you get this too much bacteria. You're not supposed to really have that much bacteria in your small intestine. So if you have overgrowth there, that's going to cause bloating and a whole host of other problems. It's a very difficult condition both to diagnose and to treat. There are lots of tests for SIBO that you can get. There's a lot of debate as to how effective they are. I've ordered them for patients and think that they're decently effective at diagnosing it. But quite frankly, if you have all the symptoms that you're going to see, that you can sort of somewhat make that diagnosis and work on it, can be a very difficult thing to treat. And the FODMAP diet has been shown to improve it, but not to the same extent as improvement with something like irritable bowel syndrome. But for patients, I've certainly had patients with what was kind of irritable bowel syndrome that I've also done testing for SIBO as well. And it has been shown to be helpful. Now with irritable bowel syndrome, so people who have like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, it's good for people who have quiescent disease, which basically means that they're not in an active inflammatory state, but they still have some symptoms. It's not really meant for people who are having really bad Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, but for people who are on meds, who are stable, but just have some symptoms, not necessarily associated with inflammation, the FODMAP diet can be quite helpful in that regard. Unfortunately, the general recommendation by people at Monash University is that this should be prescribed, the diet that is, with caution, because people with inflammatory bowel disease are already dealing with impaired nutrition of varying degrees. And if you're going to add a diet like this, which can be very restrictive in the beginning, you're not going to want to do that necessarily, because if you don't want to compromise someone who already has impaired nutrition by making a diet even more restrictive. So it's something that needs to be really worked with your gastroenterologist to talk about that, to work with a dietitian to make sure that in this case, if you're deciding to do it, that you do it in a way that is not going to further impair your overall nutrient intake. So that's something to be cautious of. Celiac, again, obviously with celiac disease, where you have an actual allergy to gluten, the issue in this situation, of course, is that the FODMAP diet is not going to cure celiac, because to cure celiac, you have to be off of gluten. But the FODMAP diet, for people who are completely off gluten, they don't always necessarily completely feel 100%. They can still have persisting symptoms. And in that case, the FODMAP diet has actually been shown to help those people just to get rid of any sort of persistent symptoms that they might be having. Of course, we mentioned that wheat has a type of fermentable sugar in it. And as a result of that, obviously the FODMAP diet is, going to have elimination of wheat, but isn't necessarily going to be completely gluten-free. So first they go on a completely gluten-free diet. Obviously, that can take a varying amount of time until they get better, checking antibodies and such. But then once everything seems to be completely clear, if they have symptoms, then a FODMAP diet can be helpful. Now, amazingly, one of the researchers at Monash did an actual study where babies that were being breastfed, if the mother went on a FODMAP diet, the babies actually got better, which makes completely no sense. But there was enough observation, they actually did a study to show it, and there was some effect, remarkably. And the most surprising one is endometriosis. Now, many of you may know this is a unfortunately, potentially very painful problem that women tend to have. There has been association between endometriosis and sensitivity in the bowels, but the mechanism is uncertain because these are two completely different systems in the body. Nonetheless, FODMAP diet has actually been shown to help with some of this sort of sensitivity in the bowels. And maybe it's just there's some connection, everything in the body is connected. And perhaps there's, in some situation here, some connection that we just don't really know about. And going on a FODMAP diet has actually been shown to help with some, not necessarily with the endometriosis overall, although it did show actually some effect. It was mostly the symptoms of sensitivity in the gut has also been shown to help in that regard. But in terms of really having the numbers to prove that it's helpful, people with irritable bowel syndrome really show an incredible improvement. And I've certainly, prescribed this for patients, and it can be dramatic, like literally within a day or two. There can be a decrease in bloating. Sometimes it takes a while for the bowel movements to become more regular and more normal in terms of formed bowel movements and such. Gas can go away almost immediately. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. But if you look at a list of foods that are high FODMAP foods, it can scare you because there are so many foods that are high in FODMAP. And when you look at them, when you're first considering this and you look at it and you're like, oh my God, how in the world am I going to do that? Just realize that you don't have to be on this forever. In the very beginning, it's best if you do complete restriction, but that complete restriction can be very, very short. I mean, we're talking like a week, it could be, because the improvement can be so dramatically fast. You can just be really, really, really restricted, completely restricted for the first week. But it's not even recommended by the people at Monash University for you to completely do that. I mean, it would be extreme because the reason is that you can often reintroduce things. And sometimes, believe it or not, things that you before couldn't tolerate, sometimes you can actually tolerate. So this can be done very quickly, even after a few weeks. And 75% of people that basically 75% of people can find the threshold or the isolate. In other words, maybe it's lactose, maybe it's beans, maybe it's, fructose. And when people the majority of people tend to be able to find that particular food that is going to make the most effect. And therefore, it just then becomes a natural part of their life where, maybe they were eating a lot of beans before and they realize that the beans are just not going to work for them. And it becomes sort of a natural lifestyle such that it's not really that restricted of a diet. They just find that, if they overeat onions or they add too much garlic, or they eat too many apples, maybe they can eat half an apple. Over time, you deal with things. The most important thing to realize is that once you are looking at all these different types of foods, you start to understand what's going on, in the sense of, maybe it's that I had a little bit of garlic and then I had an apple in my salad, and then it was a little bit of bread later on. It was, breadcrumbs on my food, or whatever the case may be. Ultimately, people become educated to be able to develop a lifestyle that isn't restrictive. And that's really the most important part here, that, of course, all these foods, as I mentioned, are foods that are generally healthy, plant-based foods that are healthy for you. And for some people, they can't digest these properly, in the sense of their microbiome essentially is causing these things to ferment abnormally. So, as I said in the very beginning, it's best to go with complete restriction and see the improvement. If you see the improvement, then really start experimenting. Start saying, okay, yeah, it's that. All right, so I'm just gonna, maybe I'll try a little bit and see how it goes. And you might find that there's certain foods, like black beans, as an example, that have a high amount of one of these things that, maybe you can't eat that at all. So maybe you try, a chickpea. Chickpea is a different balance, and maybe you can digest that one a little bit more. But the point is that after reintroduction and experimentation, almost always people really, it doesn't feel like a restrictive diet for most people. And now there are food companies out there that are creating sauces like tomato sauce and all these, famous sauces with onions and garlic, and they're able to make it without having the FODMAP ingredient, like the onions, in it. And therefore, there's an entire, subgroup of food companies that are catering to people. Of course, Miracle Noodles themselves are one of those things that people can eat. Most people, again, with wheat, have a problem with the FODMAP diet. So in this case, the Miracle Noodles are perfect because it can give you that feeling of having pasta without having to worry about that particular issue of FODMAP. So we went through the whole process and got them certified, and we were of course very pleased that it showed that there was no issue. So the point here that I've already made is that the dose is what makes this really important. In other words, maybe it's a little of this, a little of this, a little of that, just being aware of combinations of food. And again, just a little bit of your own education, looking at the lists, and you can start to understand how to slowly start incorporating these things back into your diet and coming up with a balance of things that make sense. Now, who should avoid going on a FODMAP diet? And really, it comes down to whether or not, unfortunately, 10 to 15% of people who unfortunately have an eating disorder. And over time, they just develop this chronic, slow accumulation of food restrictions, such to a point where it is like they're not getting the nutrients that you need. And this has been this sort of obsession with right eating, is called orthorexia, and it's becoming a very well-known term in even conventional medical circles, such that it's this situation that people can get into. And I think probably all of us have this to some degree when we're really trying to optimize our health, but we get to a point where, you start fearing food, fearing falling off your diet, and you start, again, this slow accumulation of, okay, I can't eat this, I can't eat that, I can't do this, I can't eat that. And slowly over time, you get to a point where you're not getting the nutrient density and the selection of foods that are required for optimal health. So we all need to be on the lookout for ourselves, that we don't get into this bind where we're just afraid to eat everything, such that we suffer in terms of overall health. And so obviously people who are already on this huge list of I can't eat this, I can't eat that, then you're going to be adding an entire whole new list of foods that technically are very, very healthy for your overall health. And at that point, there could be an issue in terms of overall health. So that's the FODMAP diet. I just put in other treatments here just so we understand and sort of remind ourselves that even with irritable bowel syndrome, as an example, they've done all kinds of studies with all kinds of other treatments. As an example, hypnotherapy. Hypnotherapy has been shown to be very, very effective for irritable bowel syndrome. So that doesn't mean the disease is all in your head. Unfortunately, anytime I raise this issue with either doctors or unfortunately patients, people tend to think that the mind, if it improves through some mind treatment, that it means that everything is in the head. The point is that everything is connected. And so when if hypnotherapy is effective, it just means that the power of the mind is such that it can calm down and improve biologically present conditions in the body. And that we should therefore make sure that we don't ignore other sorts of treatments, and that when we're treating something, we should be looking at the whole person. And that's sort of why I put that in here, because ultimately, we all know about the placebo effect. And the placebo effect, generally speaking, is around 30%. Just like on average, when you look at almost every disease, you can basically attribute 30% improvement to placebo. Now, it's different for different diseases and such, and there's all kinds of ways of enhancing the placebo. Now, it doesn't mean that the placebo is not doing anything. It just means that the power of your mind is such that it can have an effect biologically on a disease condition. So when they're doing a study and they have one wing of the study that people are getting the medicine and one wing is not getting it, they're getting a placebo. Again, on average, the people who are getting the placebo improve around 30%. That 30% number, again, totally different, but it tends to come out around 30%, which is incredibly dramatic. And they've even done studies to show that getting the mind, in this case, the mind thinks that it's getting the medicine. But if that's the case, and you can work with the mind to, for everyone to understand that your mind has the power to improve things, then that's also the form of a placebo effect, just not the one that we're speaking about. They've even done studies with the colors of the pill, the shapes of the pill. You can make all kinds of types of associations, not associations, but somehow certain color pills might have a higher impact on the placebo. Like, oh, that looks powerful, But there are other things. Obviously, the relationship you have with your doctor is going to enhance the healing of treatments, because you feel confident that you're in the hands of someone who cares for you, who is there to, is interested in you improving things. And ultimately, this is one of the most amazing things about being a doctor is to get your patient in the healing frame of mind. You're not tricking them or anything of the sort. You're getting them in a situation where you're establishing a healing relationship with them. And when people always, if I see patients and they say to me, they've seen other doctors and whatever the case may be, and after I go through, we're going to try this and we're going to try that, and they say, oh, thank you, doctor, no one's explained it that way or whatever. And then I always say something to the effect of, don't thank me now, thank me in a month when you're better, putting into their mind that they are going to be getting better, that that we've established this healing relationship and that things are going to improve. That's another way of getting the mind in the frame of mind to be in this healing mode where the mind has this power over the body. Now that's sort of a passive way of getting the mind in its place through sort of the relationship with the doctor. But ultimately, if you understand fully that your mind has this capability, then looking into various ways of relaxing the body on your own and understanding this and really accepting the fact that you have more power over your body than you think. I mean, if 30% improvement is happening with someone just because they think they're getting the medicine, then you can think that, well, if I truly acknowledge that someone could give me a sugar pill and it's making me better, then how much more so could you get into a situation where you're really working with yourself to be able to show improvement in various things. Okay, and then I wrote here, banishing the nocebo. And nocebo is the opposite of the placebo. If we believe we can get better, we can also be convinced that we're going to get worse. And unfortunately, the way some doctors talk to their patients, they introduce, unfortunately, a nocebo effect where they say, oh, this, the chances of you getting better are, 5%, and we'll do our best. This is completely unhelpful. And, you don't have to lie to a patient, but you can certainly give patients hope, regardless of the statistics, because statistics are just numbers, and there are always going to be people who are going to improve regardless of the statistics. So you can't look at people as statistics. If you look at people as statistics, and you speak to them as a statistic, then ultimately, depending on the condition, you can induce a worse outcome because of this nocebo effect. So ultimately, I just wanted to bring that in because I think it's so important that not just doctors don't even have a clear understanding of this. Unfortunately, they sort of just chalk it up and don't spend any time thinking about the placebo effect, unfortunately. And unfortunately, the problem extends to patients who are also really not aware of the power of this belief in improvement, and really accepting this belief, which is fully scientifically verifiable, as a reality, is ultimately going to improve anything, any kind of medical problem that you have, because it puts more power into your hands. You understand that you have more control over this, or a certain percentage of control more than maybe you think you have, that you're not necessarily as much of a victim as you were before understanding the fact that there is this effect. So this is part of what I always talk to people about, but that is completely far away from the FODMAP effect. So let's review briefly what the FODMAP diet, what we've spoken about tonight, just so you can get a clear understanding. So we have this FODMAP diet. We understand very clearly now that it is a bunch of different sugars that are found in different foods, and they all have individually similar side effects for certain people, like bloating and that sort of thing. And the people who came up with it realized that if they have all these similar things, if we put them all together, maybe people will improve. And so they tried it on irritable bowel syndrome with remarkable effect, and since then have tried it on lots of other types of conditions. We spoke about irritable bowel syndrome. We spoke about even inflammatory bowel disease and celiac disease for symptom improvement. We then went on to talk about the different phases where, in the beginning, you can find out within a week if this thing's going to work for you. You look at the lists, you get rid of those things, and you see if you're bloating and your gas goes away. And then if that case, give it a little bit more time, and then slowly make the introduction and work on coming up with a lifestyle of experimentation to find out how you can keep those symptoms down. And that's what the dose making the difference is that it could be that if you have onions and onions are a problem, maybe just a little bit of onion is going to be okay. But if you have already gotten to a point where, unfortunately, you've already gotten rid of so many other foods, then the next step really is to talk to a gastroenterologist and a dietitian to work out what the next step might be. If FODMAP is something that you want to try, then it probably means, in this case, that if you're already on a very restricted diet, that you should have a really frank discussion with a dietitian to say, okay, look, I've already gotten rid of so many foods. How do I do the FODMAP diet with what I'm already doing such that I don't suffer from any kind of nutrient problems, if that's the case? And then we ended up speaking about how not to be so focused on one particular thing and to start to bring in other types of ideas, especially ideas in terms of understanding the power of the mind. So that covers pretty much everything I wanted to talk about tonight. Next week, we're going to talk about the history of modern medicine, but not in the way you might think. What I'd like to talk about next week is basically that every culture has come up with its own type of medicine. We've spoken about this before, about how the philosophy of China and traditional Chinese medicine co-evolved. Same thing in India with Ayurvedic medicine. Well, what are the underlying beliefs and what are the things that have happened during recent history that have led to sort of the modern healthcare system? And there are things like just interesting things, like there was a report called the Flexner Report that was by this Dr. Flexner that basically sort of singled out pharmaceutically based sort of conventional medicine. And from that point on, it sort of became the predominant type of medical care. And from that, there's a whole host of very interesting associations between different industries. And ultimately, we've come to a point now where we have this medical system, which has its incredible benefits and, of course, some problems. And how do we understand these sorts of things? Because some of these things we just take as givens, but when we start to see the history on how it came about, it gives us a better perspective overall of modern health. So I hope you enjoy that. And I look forward to seeing you next Friday, or next Wednesday at 8 p.m. I look forward to seeing you then. Have a great night.